All right, so this week, we want to start with just a few preliminary announcements. The UNO Chris Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, which is our partner in the Department of Black Studies 50th anniversary celebration and events, has a standing exhibit entitled Charting Our Path, celebrating 50 years of Black Studies, 1971 to 2021. On the first floor of Chris Library, it features photographs and documents related to the founding of the department, including the protests and arrests of the Omaha 54, as well as the various battles, struggles, and triumphs the department has endured to maintain its status over the past 50 years. This exhibit is on display until August 31st. However, the library also has a traveling exhibit that is open at the Great Plains Black History Museum, located in the Jewel Building at 2221 North 24th Street. Now, this exhibit will run until April 1st. Due to COVID restrictions, access to the museum is by appointment. So to book an appointment, go to their website, gpblackhistorymuseum.org. If you are not in the Omaha area, the library has a digital collection of items on display and more. The links to the digital archive, as well as pictures of the exhibit, can be found in the chat, which I will share shortly, and can also be accessed from the Department of Black Studies 50th anniversary website. So from the department's website, you can see a list of upcoming events. If you scroll down, you will see links to the webinars that have already happened and links to the YouTube channel. And you also can find the links to the library's historical resources and the exhibit. That's cas.unomaha.edu/BLST50. In a related announcement, the Great Plains Black History Museum is hosting a monthly lunch and learn, where they will be discussing the history of historically Black colleges and universities. They will be held on the last Monday of every month, except December, where it will be on the third Monday at 12 o'clock Central Time. Registration is through Eventbrite, and hopefully someone will put the link in the chat. That concludes our announcements. And so from there, we will proceed with our event. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Deborah Hurd. I am the project coordinator for the Department of Black Studies 50th anniversary here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture. This webinar is one in a year-long series celebrating the department's 50th anniversary, introducing scholars who are engaged in the work of developing and using African-centric methodological approaches, which is what distinguishes Black studies. And by this, I mean Black, African-American, Africana, Pan-African, African and African diaspora studies from the mere study of Black people or Black subjects. We honor the courage of UNO's Black students during the civil rights and Black power movements, who came together to fight against the racial discrimination and cultural indifference to which they were subjected on this campus, culminating in the arrest of 54 students on November 10th, 1969, for sitting in the president's office. The arrest of the Omaha 54 galvanized the support of Omaha's Black civic, political, and religious organizations for UNO's Black students, and paved the way for the creation of a Black Studies department at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 1971, making it one of the oldest departments in the country and one of a very few in the Great Plains region. The Department of Black Studies salutes you, Omaha 54, and thanks you, Omaha's Black community, for laying the foundation for this discipline, for this department, in this space for 50 years. We thank you. As a discipline that studies, analyzes, and critiques the continuing effects of historical enslavement, colonization, land dispossession, and corporate imperialism, we cannot help but acknowledge that this university sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people for whom this city is named, the Omaha, and that of other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We stand in solidarity with you. Finally, we stand with the students, faculty, staff, and administrators of historically Black colleges and universities who have had the peace of their academic learning spaces disrupted by bomb threats for the past several weeks. We pray for your safety and protection, and we call upon the federal authorities to investigate and prosecute these acts to the absolute fullest extent of the law. We stand with you and we support you in your efforts to learn, to live, and to exist in an environment free of fear, free of hate. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Valethia Watkins. Dr. Watkins is an associate professor of Africana Studies and the director of the Women's Studies Graduate Certificate Program at Howard University. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from the University of Michigan, a Juris Doctorate from the Ohio State University College of Law, a Master of Arts in African American Studies from the Ohio State University, and a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University. Her research interests include the investigation of Africana approaches to the study of gender and culture, Black women's intellectual history, and the intersection of race and racism in American feminist thought. Now, while in graduate school, Dr. Watkins was introduced to and embraced by African-centered communities of scholars. And by the mid-1990s, these elders, the established scholars, was so impressed with the level of intellectual rigor and dynamism that she and her associates showed that this trio of up-and-coming graduate scholars was dubbed the New Jack Scholars: Greg Carr, the late Troy Allen, and Valethia Watkins. Now, to provide a little context for you who may not be Gen Xers like Dr. Watkins and myself, the early 1990s was when New Jack City was one of the most popular movies that came out early, I think 1991. That was followed and accompanied by a brand of hip hop music that was called New Jack Swing. So in keeping with that, we had New Jack City, New Jack Swing, and the New Jack Scholars. So I'd like to introduce you. She's no longer a New Jack, but she is a scholar, Dr. Valethia Watkins.
Thank you, Dr. Hurd. I appreciate that.
Oh, I'm not doctor yet, so we still working on that dissertation.
That's just a piece of paper in terms of your scholarship and credentials. But yes, Professor Hurd, I appreciate that warm welcome. And I want to thank you and the department, Dr. Cynthia Robinson, and your entire team for this fantastic event and for inviting me to this conversation to help celebrate 50 years of Black studies at UNO. So important in the context in which we exist now.
Yes, yes. So before I turn it over to you, I have just a few questions to ask. So last week's lecture, we had Dr. Quincy Mills, and Dr. Mills had a degree in business. His background is in business. He had business in the MBA, and he ended up doing history. So how do you, Dr. Watkins, how did you go from studying law to African-American studies?
Oh, thank you for that question. When I was in law school, I had the opportunity with some of my classmates to begin attending community-based study group, the African Center for Study and Worship. And this community-based study group was outside of a law school. It was community people, grassroots activists, everyday ordinary people coming from their day jobs who loved reading, thinking, and debating the issues of the day. So that going to that center just opened my eyes up to how much of our knowledge of our history and culture that I had not been given, and how fully miseducated, like so many other people were, that I found myself to be too. So we read books, we had guest speakers, and when you talk about my introduction or initiation to the African Center community, it started there because the guest speakers were master teachers like Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, Dr. Marimba Inez. So many came to the center and came in through the city and shared their knowledge. And so when you tied it back to what was going on in the 90s, hate to date myself, but this was a time before the internet, and people were providing that knowledge in cassette tapes. So to have a collection of cassette tapes and VHS tapes with all of these speakers was just the thing we did. And that's opened the door to the knowledge. And then to circle back to law, once that appetite was whet, my colleague, Dr. Greg Carr, and myself went back to the law school and petitioned for them actually to allow us to pursue a joint degree, a JD, Master's in Black Studies, because we had other colleagues who were getting joint degrees in business, joint degrees in public health, JD in BA, and et cetera, and so on. And they agreed to do that. But ultimately, we decided to wrap up our law degree, and then I went into Black Studies at Ohio State.
Okay, so I have two questions that kind of link to your response. So my next question was going to be, how does law inform your thinking or frame your thinking in African American studies? But the other question, because you started naming all of these people who are big names that were involved in your community study group that were coming to lecture. So the other question is, who are some of the scholars in the field that serve as role models or icons for you?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of how law informs my thinking, one of the major passionate areas of research that I have pursued is the study of the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the Constitution relative to voting, which is very relevant to what is taking place now. And what we were introduced to in terms of a narrative about thinking about these issues in law school deviated very much from how lay people were interpreting these amendments. And so that really started me to question and to develop my understanding of our role in fighting for having political participation, and not just participating passively in voting, but in terms of being leaders and in electoral politics, but beyond that in everyday politics. So that led me to, if we're going to talk about, it's hard to say just a single person, because there are so many in this tradition, in this genealogy, that have laid the foundation. And I take pieces and knowledge from all of them. But one person that doesn't get enough credit that I really want to give credit is my colleague, Dr. Greg Carr, who is a master teacher. I don't have to tell you, you know Dr. Carr, but for those who don't know him, he's a brilliant thinker, writer, scholar. He is the former chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. We went to law school together, and he is the person that began to introduce me to the center, the African community-based study groups. And then from there, the larger group of scholars that I mentioned. And so in that context, he's one of the people, leading voices that help develop a methodological framework unique to Africana studies to begin to approach thinking about these issues in terms of how we study Black studies, not just Black study as subject matter. So he, in one level, is a peer and colleague, but in other level, anybody knows him, just know he's the absolute genius in what he does. And so he convenes the largest Africana studies classroom in the world every week on YouTube in a video class that he does called In Class with Carr. And then he has a new show called The Black Table with Dr. Carr. And I'm saying that because I think it's important that we recognize the major figures. When we look at master teachers like Clark and others, they were peers of their fellow travelers. And so I want to acknowledge my peer, because he is really responsible in terms of not only setting an example, but in terms of introducing me to this community and being a colleague along the way. And so when I talk about his brilliance, it's facts, not hyperbole. So if you check him out on YouTube, you will see the brilliance that I'm speaking about.
And I will place those links in the chat as your lecture goes on. But thank you for that. So my final question is one that segues into your presentation. So your dissertation topic was critique of Black feminist gender discourse from 1970 to the present. And really from the time of writing your dissertation research proposal, you've built your career on the study of Black women and the critique of various methodological approaches to the study of Black women's issues. What drew you to this topic for your dissertation and the continuation for your future research or for your further research?
As I became more connected in Africana studies and joined the Black Studies program at Ohio State University in pursuit of my master's degree program, I was introduced to Black women's intellectual history, Black women's social and political thought. One of the figures that really led me to that is Ida B. Wells. But in the context of being a Black studies scholar, there was a great deal of debate and a great deal of conversation around Black women's relationship to feminism. And it was a very contentious relationship. And there was always debate about whether you were a feminist or a womanist, which one. And in that context of debate, I came across a book by Dr. Vivian Gordon, one of the leading scholars in Black studies, one of the founding scholars in Black studies. And she wrote a book called Black Women, Feminism, Black Liberation, Which Way? And that book helped provided some guidance and guidelines of how to think through these issues relative to that debate of whether or not a person was a feminist or a womanist. And it's in that context that many of the questions that I began to address and talk about in my dissertation led me to the path that I have taken in terms of my scholarship. So what I want to talk about today is some critical issues in Black women's studies and framing this conversation within the context of Black women's studies, within the context of Africana studies, within the context of Africana studies, beginning to integrate gender and questions of gender and explore questions of gender. In order to do that from our own culturally specific perspective, it becomes critically important that we talk about these issues from our own internal cultural logic, using our own internal frames of reference. And so I'm going to start off with this quote by one of the leading Black feminist scholars, Patricia Hill Collins. And this is out of an article she wrote called What's in a Name? Womanism, Black Feminism, and Beyond. And one of the key points that is important that she raised in this article, in that context of this debate of whether to be a womanist or feminist, Africana womanist or Black feminist or African feminist, she said these current debates about whether Black women's standpoint would be named womanism or Black feminism reflects the basic challenge of accommodating diversity among Black women. So in that context, or in that vein, the field of Black women's studies has not done a sufficient job in acknowledging the fuller spectrum of ideological and political ideals that Black women bring to the table. In other words, Black women are not monolithic. Black women have diverse political commitments, ideological commitments, diverse perspective. And yet when people talk about us relative to these issues, it's always framed as trying to find the standpoint, the official singular name for the Black women's intellectual tradition or Black women's political activism. A dominant voice is Black feminism, but there are other schools of thought like Africana womanism. So even in this article, where she's talking about the political diversity among Black women and between Black women, even in this article, she commits the same politics of citation that has erased the Black women's studies scholars or the Black studies scholars who are Black women. And so one of the key perspectives there is Africana womanism. And so even in this conversation where Pat Hill Collins is talking about the diversity, she still erases the Black studies scholars who are Black women who have a different point of view. And so going back to that initial conversation when I talked about Vivian Gordon, one of the things I realized as people were talking about the contentious relationship between Black women and Black feminism and debating those questions, it came to my awareness that many of the Black women scholars or Black scholars had a preference for Africana womanism. And so like everyone else, I began to ask the question, well, what is the distinction between feminism, Black feminism, womanism, Africana womanism, African feminism, et cetera, and so on. And so that is what has been a framing ideal as I pursued this. And these questions. But one of the things I would say, the starting point for addressing those questions are not just how you feel or coming into the current debate based on what is on social media. If we look at history and let history be our guide, that provides a point of reference for addressing these issues. So these three broad topics I want to touch upon as we walk through this conversation today. And so again, I'm framing this as a conversation around Black women's studies within Africana studies, and looking at the fact that, or starting from the premise that how and why, or I should say the question, how and why an analysis of gender within Africana studies should be distinct or different from a traditional conversation about gender. How and why we should reconceptualize gender as a category analysis before we incorporate, or as we incorporate it in Africana studies, that we cannot just take the current social construction of gender and just slap it into Black studies without doing a disservice to Black women, because many of the concepts and constructs and ideals that are being borrowed from women's studies, traditional women's studies, were designed without Black women in mind. And so with that, the three, those are kind of my ongoing framing questions, the larger questions that I deal with as we are trying to develop an Africana studies specific approach to these questions. So the three broad topics I want to touch upon today is looking at this concept called compulsory feminism, a type of feminism or a dynamic within feminism that must be named and that we have named in our scholarship as a preliminary challenge that has blocked or arrested the development of or knowledge of alternative perspective. And that arrested development is intentional. There are certain very deliberate strategies that are used to make feminism appear compulsory and therefore erase or render invisible other conversations around these questions. And then I want to reframe the womanism and feminism debate and its implications for Black women's studies within the context of Africana studies, and then introduced a concept called non-aligned women or non-aligned orientation, which is an Africana studies approach to these topics. So 3 fast facts. Let me give you some 3 takeaway conclusions, and then we'll walk backwards to how we come to these conclusions as we go through the presentation. But the 3 takeaways are: 1, compulsory feminism is a movement which has colonized women's studies. It is often unnamed, and so that is what our scholarship is doing, naming it so that we can begin to challenge it. It is visible, it's there, but it's hidden in plain sight. And so we're going to talk about what is compulsory feminism and how has it colonized feminist studies. Well, actually, fast fact number 2 leads you a big clue as to how it has colonized women's studies, traditional women's studies. The habit of conflating women's studies with feminist studies undermines the power and promise of Black women's studies. And so we're going to talk about why it is not appropriate to define women's studies in such a narrow way that it not only centers or privileges feminism, but it defines an entire field by one single theoretical perspective, and erases all other theoretical perspectives and alternatives. And number three, the point is the binary choice that is often framed, are you a womanist or are you a feminist, as if there is no other option, does not represent the full or a fuller range of possibilities. And so before I jump in, let me just add a couple of caveats. Some people are already turned off because of how I'm framing feminism. So let me just add these couple of caveats as we're moving forward. First, I want to say that this critique of feminism that we're setting forth is very distinct from the traditional critique of feminism. And when I say the traditional critique, the critique that is a knowledge that is made by Black feminists or Black advocates of feminism or Black followers of feminism, their critique has a different purpose and function or a different end game than the critique that I'm setting forth. So the purpose is different because for them, their critique is to present a laundry list of the flaws of feminism. And then the ask is for them to fix it so that they could, and I'm talking about white feminists or feminism writ large, to fix these laundry lists of problems in order with the end game being inclusion. That is the goal. So they want to be included. Now, some have decided, well, I'll join feminism before they fix the problem and work on fixing the problems from the inside. This critique that I am engaging in is the end game is very different. So rather than inclusion, the function of the critique is to advocate and clear space for independence. So think of it as the Declaration of Independence. So inclusion is not the end goal. Self-determination is the end goal. We want to engage in a culturally grounded conversation around gender that is rooted in the political interest and image of African people. So so this is not about critiquing feminism so it could be fixed for us to join. It is not based on the assessment that I have seen, the best or even the most effective way for us to address these gender issues and questions within our community. But that's not to say that it it's not effective for other groups of women to apply to their lives, especially those women for which they serve as the frame of reference or the point of reference for feminism. My point about this issue is that feminism doesn't have the same probative value for Black people as it does for other women. So it doesn't, it has some basic fundamental problems with its premises. But that aside, ultimately, this is really a conversation about choice. And again, going back to the point I made originally was that no one singular theoretical perspective has a monopoly on truth, and no one singular theoretical perspective will define a field. There will be multiple methodologies and theoretical perspectives that will be in conversation with each other. So this is about creating a climate where different theoretical perspectives can coexist, not deferring, not required to have undue deference to feminism, and not in the shadow of feminism, but free to make their contribution to the forward flow of knowledge about women. And so ultimately the takeaway is, I'm not trying to take your feminism away from you. If that is the choice that some of you make, it is really about you not imposing your feminism on me or defining the entire field by one theoretical perspective. So it is about mutual respect. It's about reciprocity. And I like to use the phrase or quote Tabitha Brown. Those of you who are vegan are very well aware who Tabitha Brown is. So if you want to be a feminist, that's your business. But what the issue is that you do not, just like you have the right to choose to be a feminist, others should have the right to not choose to be a feminist. This is a text, one of the founding texts within the field of Black women's studies, published in 40 years ago. This is actually the 40th anniversary of this text, published in 1982. The editors were Gloria T. Hall, Patricia Bell Scott, Barbara Smith. So this year marks the 40th anniversary. The name of the book is But Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies. And in that text, they make the following assertion about the role and relationship of feminism to Black women's studies. And they say, only a Black and feminist analysis can sufficiently comprehend the materials of Black women's studies, and only a creative Black feminist perspective will enable the field to expand. And so again, this is a beginning part of the conversation, which sets the context or the groundwork where the politics of citation and cancel culture emanates from this, that those perspectives that were different. Now, they have a right to their opinion about the central role they would like feminists to play. But the point is that feminism is not the only perspective that can yield insights and grounded knowledge about African people in relationship to gender. And so this is an example of the starting point of compulsory feminism and how it functions. This is a quote, so let's go back to history. As I said previously, history can be a guide, and we can look at this intellectual tradition that has been erased from our knowledge as one theoretical perspective has come to dominate the conversation. This is a quote by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. In 1895, she called together the first National Convention of Black women, the Black Club women, to Boston to talk about Black women's creating a national organization to begin to work more collectively. People were working in their cities, in their own individual clubs and their own individual political groups. But she saw, and others saw, the need that we can be even stronger if we create a larger network with these different groups of Black women from different cities. So over 100 women came from all across the country to Boston in 1895. They heeded her call. And the following year, that national organization was created. It's the National Association of Colored Women. But this quote here, which is a vital quote, and I quote it often because it alludes to a different orientation that Black women are bringing to the conversation about gender. They're not talking about gender in isolation from race, class, and other social categories, and they're not isolating Black women from the larger community. So yes, there are rights that Black women have been denied, but that is a part of the larger rights that Black people have been denied. So they frame the issues as Black women a part of Black communities, as opposed to Black women as their own separate entity, distinct from and disconnected from the larger collective. And so she addresses the sisters who have gathered, and this is what she says to them. Our movement is a women's movement in that it is led and directed by the women of the race for the good of women and men. We ask the active interest of our men. We are not alienating or withdrawn. We are only coming to the front, willing to join any others in the same work. And this encapsulates in a very succinct statement the different framework from which African women are operating from. So I think the first point to highlight is when she said our movement. So she's addressing the Black women who are there. Our movement is a woman's movement. It's led and directed by us, but who are the beneficiaries of it? It's not for women, by women, about women, but it's for women and men, about women and men, about the collective. And we're going to take the lead. And I think the key point to pick up on is our movement. So she's declaring that Black women are forming a movement that is distinct from the other women's movement. There is another women's movement that is occurring, unfolding at the same time. But now she's saying, we're not just copying them, we're not just joining them, we are defining this movement on our own terms. Our movement is going to be in the image and interest of Black women. So this agency that she's exhibiting, this self-determination to define their movement from their own cultural reference to address issues in the way that best suits them. And so in that case, she's outlining how we're distinct from what they're doing. We want and ask the active participation of our men. So she's talking about charting a course that will have Black men and women working in collaboration, in cooperation, in distinction from the other movement, the other women's movement that made the choice to purge men from their movement, that decided to exclude men from their movement, that decided to construct a non-egalitarian movement. It wasn't a movement of women and men working together. It was a movement that centered conflict and opposition. And they have a right to do that. But we were coming from a different circumstance. So grounding this movement in our circumstance, the difference is that, for example, they were purging men from their movement, the other women purge men from their movement, because it is their men who are in power, who are choosing, who have rights, and are choosing to block them from getting those same rights. Well, our building block starts with Black men and women both being deprived of rights. So Black men are not opposing Black women having, for example, the right to vote. They're actually working with Black women having the right to vote. So it doesn't trigger the same kind of conflict. So what people naturalize as the natural way of doing things, separate from men and in opposition, is not really natural. It is based on using one group of women's frame of reference, their frame of reference. So their men have rights, are in power, are denying them rights, actually actively opposing them getting the rights, and are blocking them from getting the rights. And you come over in our community, our men are not blocking us from getting the rights, don't have the rights themselves, and are willing to join us to fight for our collective rights. And so that's why she says we're not alienated from or estranged from, at war with, in conflict with Black men as a group. Now, there are always individual exceptions. There's the Clarence Thomas back in this day. There are others who, Candace Owen back in this day. So it's not your gender or your body type that is determining your position on politics. It is your commitment and your consciousness that is determining whether people can work with you or not. So we're not alienating or withdrawing. We're only coming to the front, willing to join any others in the same. And so this is a very key distinction between our movement and their movement, and it represents and reflects a very different orientation. So going back to the question of feminism, there is a grand contradiction or paradox that is often overlooked, and that is the idea that men and women should have equal rights is not a radical or controversial ideal. This ideal is widely accepted. And yet, although feminists claim a close association as being the leading voice for fighting for women to have rights, that's one way in how they define themselves, yet they remain, the idea remains controversial and divisive. And so it's worth asking yourself why. If the very thing they're closely associated with is uncontroversial, is not radical, then why the people who are best known for fighting for that idea? And now the point is, they're not the only ones fighting, but best promote themselves as fighting for that idea. Why then do they remain so controversial? And I would submit to you is that there's another side to feminism. There's a flip side. Yes, on one hand, that ideal is associated with them, but there are other ideals that are not as helpful that are associated with them. You can look at many polls. This is a Huffington Post poll from 2013, and you will see over and over again, there was a more recent poll that was done with millennials. Many people agree with the ideal of equality of the sexes, believe men and women should have the same rights, but still are reluctant to call themselves feminists. So we're gonna talk to this point that has caused a problem for feminists, because on the one hand, this contradiction where they represent themselves as speaking for women, advocating for women, speaking for all women as the voice of women, and yet many of the very women they profess to speak for distance themselves or do not want to embrace feminism. So how does one reconcile that contradiction? Now, often that contradiction is not even addressed. In fact, it's often overlooked in the literature, but I think it is really very important to take a look at that, because that rejection or resistance that has been there since the very beginning has become a sore spot or Achilles heel for feminists. I said before it was a paradox, but it is a sore spot, and they have not sat by idly and just ignored that, because that rejection has the potential to undermine their centering themselves as the one and only authentic voice. So they have developed a series of strategies to deal with that, I guess one could call dirty laundry that so many women themselves have come to view feminism with skepticism or have not enthusiastically embraced it. And so we're going to talk about, there are many strategies they do to render feminism compulsory, mandatory, to take away the choice. But we're going to single out, in the interest of our time, 3, and that is rigging the definition of feminism, the promotion of this ideal called de facto feminism, and then the third one being something I've identified in my scholarship called the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. A short definition of what compulsory feminism is, or how it operates. It's designed to take away choice. It's designed to render moot or turn the questioning whether or not you're a feminist into a rhetorical question. So it doesn't matter how you define the field, as particularly if they dominate the field in such a way to erase voices that don't align with feminism. So it's a way to override the rejection of feminism or negate resistance to feminism. And again, that's just another brief summary of the 3-way: rigged definition, Black Feminist Revisionist History Project, and the concept of de facto feminism. So let's get with the question: what is the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project, and what are the goals? What's the purpose? So this is a short definition, a short succinct definition. It is the practice of indiscriminately or randomly reclassifying as feminists historically significant Black women in our history. It's really Black women and men, but primarily Black women, often posthumously, often after death, going back and reclassifying them and labeling them as feminists, when often in the historical record doesn't support that in terms of evidence that they identified in that way. In terms of when they knew of the word feminist and they didn't use it in public settings, or they didn't join feminist group, et cetera, and so on. And so what we found in the past 50 years that On the one level, we've had a proliferation of scholarship on Black women in our history, uncovering so much new knowledge about Black women in our history. And we've seen a proliferation in scholarly texts, articles, reference books, et cetera, and so on. But in this proliferation of scholarship, which is excellent and should be celebrated because it is to all of our benefit to gain new knowledge about women in our history, because that is the starting point to have the tools in which to address some of the questions of our day about gender issues. If we are able to reference our own frame of history, then we can see how we got to where we are today and not treat where we are today the way it's always been in history, and to normalize what we're dealing with today as if this is the natural order of things and this is the way it has always been, that it's natural to have beef between different genders. It's natural to have gender war. It's natural to have battle of the sexes. No, it's not natural, and it's not the way it's always been, even if it's described as the way it is today. And so we need to know how we got here, and only having cultural literacy, historical literacy, will we be able to have informed decisions and choice about how do we address these issues that we're facing. And so that's why having this literacy becomes important. And you see a couple of texts here. Many of those reference books and articles that I just spoke about, many of them have the unfortunate habit of engaging in the Black Feminist Revisionist History Project. So they either, all of the historical figures, they'll say Fannie Lou Hamer was a feminist. They'll say Ida B. Wells was a feminist. They'll say Ella Baker was a feminist, and Mariah Stewart was a feminist. And so even when you call them Black feminists, and that term was not even in usage before the mid 20th century. And yet, if that term was uncontroversial, if it was a universally accepted term, that would be one thing. But it is a term that comes with a lot of political ambiguity, baggage, and problems. And so that's why that becomes a problem. The mission is a backdoor appeal to convert young women and others. It is to turn history into a usable past. So overt appeals may not have worked. And so they're using history to justify increasing their popularity or gaining acceptance. So it works like how a celebrity endorses any product. So to get people to buy into feminism, it is turning these very important historical figures into icons of feminism. And then the message becomes, if you adopt feminism, you're walking in the footsteps of your ancestors. When in reality, these women didn't endorse these ideals. And so it silences their own self-definition and self-interpretation. And so before you had celebrity endorsement by gaining historical figures, and now you have actually going out and getting actual celebrities to endorse. And this has become a phenomenon based on the reach of social media. You know, Black Twitter and social media, it's a very important tool and give people access to people that they never had before. So around 2013, and you could go and begin to do some research yourself on the internet, you begin to have, through the power of social media, reporters and others asking different young Hollywood pop icons and stars this question: are you a feminist? And then what's your definition of feminism? So one of the earliest engagement of this question with Beyonce, you see represented in British Vogue in 2013. And there's some ambivalence expressed, and that's in the larger context. To understand that ambivalence, you have to look at the larger context where other pop stars like Taylor Swift and others have been asked that question, and they have said something to the effect, yes, I believe in the social equality of the sexes. Katy Perry, Kelly Clarkson, all of them said, I believe in equality of the sexes, but I'm not a feminist. And the blowback and the backlash and the social media hit that they took was tremendous. So that's kind of the larger context. And so you see here Beyonce aware of that and says, I don't know, that word could be extreme, very extreme, but I guess I'm a modern day feminist. I do believe in equality and that we have a ways to go. And so, and then she embraces it. And then she says, why do we have to choose what type of woman we are? Why we have to label ourselves? I'm just a woman. I love being a woman. So she equivocates here. And so I don't know where she stands and how she feels. We know later she's going to adopt Chimamanda Adichie's definition in her song Flawless. But I will say this is really an example of that dynamic of compulsory feminism. This is the Rigg definition. This is a classic dictionary definition that one finds often. It says a feminist, a person who believes in the social and political equality of the sexes. My point to you is that this is a false and misleading definition. Subscribing to this belief does not necessarily translate into feminism. This belief is not the intellectual property of feminism. Therefore, it's an inappropriate litmus test. It's like saying, do you believe in God? And if you believe in God, that makes you a Baptist, or that makes you a Catholic. Yes, of course, Baptists and Catholics and many other faith communities believe in God, but that alone is not the litmus test for what makes you Catholic or Baptist. So subscribing to the belief of God, it takes more than that. Does not necessarily make you a specific religious person, belonging to a specific religious tradition. And so the bottom line with this is that we have to separate the ideal of the belief in the social and political equality of the sexes from feminism, which represents one way out of many other possibilities for pursuing or achieving the political and social equality of the sexes, but it's not the only way. And so therefore becoming a feminist does not automatically, becoming a person who believes in equality of sexes doesn't automatically make you a feminist. And you do not have to be a feminist to advocate against inequality or to be against the system of patriarchy. De facto feminism is the second way we see compulsory feminism. It is a strategy, and de facto means in fact by tradition or custom. And so in this regard, I like to, my shorthand way of thinking about de facto feminism is the kind of easy saying, was grandma a feminist? And what I mean by that, I've often read in feminist accounts where they're talking about someone in their family, a woman who's a powerful, strong, independent, outspoken woman, and that woman did not define themselves as a feminist. And the writer will acknowledge grandma didn't know that word feminist, or if she knew it, she rejected it and she didn't call herself a feminist. But I'm going to override grandma's self-definition and impose the word feminism on her because she was strong, powerful, independent, outspoken. And right there, that is the attempt to say these traits are the property of feminists alone, that anybody who has these traits automatically become a feminist, and it begins to set up a hierarchy and disrespect among women. So any woman who is not a feminist is subordinated to feminists because it is only feminists who are recognized and allowed to be strong, powerful, and independent and outspoken. But the larger point is that just like that definition, the belief in the equality of the sexes is not their property, neither are these traits their property. There are certain ideals that belong to humanity writ large. And so when we ask about those ideals of, we have to ask, when we want to ask what is feminism, we have to begin with what is unique to feminism. So this is just a quick outline of what I call the deal breakers, the reasons why Black women have resisted feminism. So yes, they have been willing and able and at the forefront of fighting for fairness, equality, and justice, and opposing patriarchy and sexism, but they have also had a contentious relationship with feminism. And it's the history of betrayal, the history of discrimination, racism within feminism, the lack of a strategy by feminists to deal with white supremacy outside of their ranks and within their ranks, the Eurocentric bias, which makes white women normative in the default womanhood, the primacy of gender, when they tried to isolate gender away from these other categories and treat it as a standalone issue. And then the anti-male orientation, whether it's male bashing or purging of men, how they frame those issues have all been reasons why Black women have rejected feminism. And so their rejection is often dismissed as them either not being willing to stand up for women, not as brave, not as courageous, et cetera, so on. But what is not acknowledged is that they have legitimate disagreements with key aspect of feminism, that they are dissatisfied with their record of race and racism, and they're unconvinced that feminism is the best approach. Clenora Hudson Weems, the author of Africana Womanism, Reclaiming Ourselves, one of the leading promoters of Africana Womanism, she makes the argument that confronting a patriarchal system that oppresses women in general is a concern for all people. It's not just women's work, it's everybody who care about women, who are stakeholders in women being free from patriarchy and sexism. And thus addressing gender problem in society does not necessarily translate to feminism. Vivian Gordon, who I mentioned as an important voice in these debates over which way, she wrote a book. This is the book I referenced, Black Women, Feminism and Black Liberation, Which Way? And she said clearly overt resistance to the term feminism by so many Black women is not their misunderstanding of the definition in common usage. Rather, it is an important statement, I would say, declaration of identity and politics. This is such a key point because when people say they're not a feminist, the blowback they often get is this ideal that challenges their intellect, they challenge their intelligence. And so people say feminism is just the simple ideal that you believe in equality of the sexes. Is not just that simple idea. And we hopefully have established that that cannot be the litmus test. So within Africana studies, it became important as a preliminary challenge to clear the intellectual space to deal with these issues on our own terms, grounded in our own historical perspective, to create a collective term that gives us the ability to free the space to think differently, to get us, to allow us to transcend that womanism versus feminism divide. And so there is the invisible majority out there. So a lot of times when people reject the feminism, they were asked the question, well, if you're not a feminist, then what are you? Or worse, because Non-Aligned didn't accept either feminism or womanism, they are erased from the narratives about gender, and their voices are either co-opted or silenced, or they're ostracized. And so a collective term became necessary to gain visibility, to create the space for others to join in this conversation. So Non-Aligned is a collective name for those who need representation and visibility. Of course, they oppose the system of patriarchy and the system of sexism and racism and white supremacy. They fight for gender equality without equivocation. And then the bottom line is they believe a person can fight for gender justice without being a feminist. And they definitely push back on the ideal that feminists have a monopoly on caring about women or fighting about women. And then if we read, I said, to be fair, I said, if we're going to talk about defining feminism, we need to start from the point of asking ourselves, what is unique to feminism? So fighting for women is not what is unique, because there are people who fight for women who are not feminists. Feminist represents a way to make sense and a way to fight for women. And so reading Africana, reading feminism through Africana Studies, we start with what is unique to feminism as a definition. So these are our working definitions of feminism. Feminism is a set of theories which define men and women primarily as adversaries. It is grounded in belief they are members of two separate and distinct groups on opposite sides politically. This is so critically important because, again, we take for granted today as we talk about these issues of framing men and women as though they are not members of the same group and not affected by these things collectively. Feminism is a study of gender pathology or the study of pathological models of gender to the exclusion of the study of healthy, positive, constructive, and more egalitarian models of gender. Now, for some of you, the very ideal that there are constructive, positive, healthier models of gender that exist in the world is an oxymoron, because so much grounded in pathology of gender thinking that there is no possibility in some people's consciousness. It's unthinkable that there are other cultures that may have done a better job. Not perfect, not utopia, but on certain elements may have done a better job with gender, and we have things we can learn from them. And so it is important that we even raise that question. So we're going to get to just briefly, we're going to wrap up with, kind of bring it in. So we talked about non-aligned, we critiqued compulsory feminism. And so let's just end with the two distinct schools of thoughts on womanism. On the one hand, you have womanism as articulated by Alice Walker, where she says a womanist is a Black feminist or a feminist of color. And then to solidify the relationship, she says womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So the key point is that for her, the distinction is, what's the difference between womanism and Africana womanism? It is how they see their relationship with regards to feminism. Is womanism just a feminism by another name? Is it an attempt to repackage feminism with a new label in order to, as a strategy to sell it to Black people? Or is it really a viable alternative given the dissatisfaction and a legitimate critique Black women have had? For Alice Walker's point of view, womanism and feminism are interchangeable. It is, womanism is feminism. It's just another name for Black feminism. And for her, it was important because feminists, white women could just say, I'm a feminist. They didn't say I was a white feminist. And so she wanted to create a term where Black women can say I'm a womanist without having to say a Black womanist or add that adjective. But she see these two things as inseparable and linked. And then you had people like Bell Hooks and Beverly Guy Sheftall, who said that women who chose womanism over feminism and thought they were doing something different, but that's what a lot of people did, they were really misunderstanding Alice Walker intent. And then you have Kenora Hudson Weems' Africana womanism, representing many of the women who were in Black study spaces, whereas womanists and feminists tended to be in other fields. She argues that womanism is not an addendum or extension of any version of feminism, that she's trying to create an alternative approach. So she's disconnecting it, and she saying that it is about using the collective strength of the community to address these gender issues. This is a text by Laylee Phillips that will give you more information about womanism and the history of womanism. And I will conclude here. If people want some text that kind of helped inform my thinking, but want to get started of looking at this alternative approach to these questions, I highly recommend books by Oyeronke Oluwumi, African woman scholar who's done pioneering work in developing a conceptualization of gender, which breaks the chain with Western ideals and creating actual paradigms for creating a different way to engage these questions. Neera Sadarkisha, African-American, who did that years before Oluwumi, And her book, The Strength of Our Mother, a series of essays, especially one of her most quoted essays, The Status of Women in Africa. And then this relatively new book by a woman of color out of Australia, White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color, which we'll talk about kind of the Karen syndrome, but she doesn't call it Karen, but really the damsel in distress, what we call Karen, and how this plays out in the modern workplace, but also she grounds you in history on these issues. So I thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing, and I eagerly look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Watkins. That was fascinating, always, always fascinating. So we have a question, Q&A from Dr. Catherine Adams. She says, thank you for your work, Dr. Watkins. In your classes and on your campus, how are your articulations and scholarship received by students in general and young women specifically?
Well, thank you, Dr. Adams, who's doing fantastic work down in Claflin and a brilliant colleague. And I appreciate that question. It depends. Each semester is like a box of chocolate, and it depends on you know, what it is that they're engaging at a particular moment. And so you get the range of reactions. I get some people who are like, wow, I didn't realize I had a choice. I actually believed in the equality of the sexes. And so they will say, I've been compulsed into feminism. And so to have the option and to look at these historical figures really opens their mind to like, I get to have an informed choice about these matter. And then you have people who will go toe to toe, who are very much grounded in the men versus women. Men are predators, men are evil, men are, et cetera, so on. So see, they don't know how to mask it yet, that they're not bashing men, or et cetera, and so on. But one of the things I try to help walk them through is just like you don't want to say one particular race are the terrorists. Like if one person do something bad, you say all are bad. To begin to have them thinking in two different ways. First, that there's a spectrum of men. And so yes, the category of men you talk about do exist, do indefensible things, but why would you erase the other category of men that are upstanding people with good character? And so you're talking about a subset. Don't define an entire group of people by a subset. So we so quick to say the men, the women, and that is that very much quintessential feminist thinking. The other thing is to shift people from thinking about the men, the women, because those have become loaded terms. Think about gender in terms of family ties, the mother to the son, the father to the daughter, the sister to the brother, the grandfather to the grandchildren. And when we think about that, we humanize people again and their humanity, and we can move away from the very stereotypes that we have taken on and imbibed. So I get a lot of enriching, stimulating conversation. I try to create a nurturing environment. And so I'm happy to say that there are people who are willing to explore these issues and become informed. But I'm also have to say that I'm challenged because a lot of people get their understanding from social media. And so we really have to create media literacy, because people can be agent provocateurs for clickbait, and young people, and they're not by themselves. We can see what's going on in society. There are many people who are being miseducated, misinformed through disinformation, very deliberate disinformation on social media. And I have noticed myself that there are people who quote unquote sound so pro-Black, so down on social media, but these are agents of the conservative movement. If you actually know the buzzwords, if you know what they're actually saying. So we need to step up our cultural literacy teaching for our students, because so many people, all of us, are being bombarded with disinformation, deliberate, on social media.
Okay, so I had a question while you're presenting, and I was thinking when you were talking about the reclamation project, and I'll bring out one instance, because you talked about the women, but I know that you've talked about some men that have been reclaimed as feminists, and specifically your discussion on people like Frederick Douglass. So can you talk about Frederick Douglass in that context of the quote unquote feminist movement of his time? Because we know that that feminist movement was around a push for women, the women's right to vote. And because he was advocated for women, to get the right to vote, people have said, oh, he was a feminist. But then can you talk about him in relationship to the feminist of the movement at that time?
Yes. So yes, Frederick Douglass was just pivotal in the fight for women's suffrage. He was at that 1848 convention. And when I think it's very notable that they have a historical tablet or marker at the very site, because they framed this as the first women's rights convention in world history. And on that historical marker, there are two names, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. So I think it's very notable that there is a Black man's name. And a lot of people think it would be Susan B. Anthony. She wasn't even at that particular meeting, but his name is there because not only was he unwavering in his support, but also because he, when they brought up that issue, they have a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which outlined what their grievances were and what they were going to fight for. Every resolution passed unanimously except for one, and that was the issue of fighting for the right to vote. It was even controversy among the white women's rights activists who split on that issue, and it was about to fail. And it was Frederick Douglass who Elizabeth Cady Stanton turned to give a speech. And, at that time, he's like Obama to them in terms of his juice. And so he gives a speech and they just go ahead and vote for it or whatever. And so even though they turned against him and discriminated against him, the issue was bigger than them, because students always ask, well, given the insults and the lying and all of the things they did, disinviting him and stuff, why was he still there? And it's really a lesson in politics. Certainly you have to think about the coalitions you form, but secondly, sometimes you have to, the issue is bigger than individual people. The issue of getting that right to vote will benefit Black people, Black women. And so even though the white women discriminated against him, it was bigger than that. And he also had some sentimental feelings, because when he was enslaved, and the assistance he got from white abolitionists, even though he had some conflicts with them too, he still held out for what's, standing on principle, regardless of the flaws of the individuals in the struggle.
Okay. So one other question I had was, can you talk about the role of the Black Power movement and how in its aftermath we have women who are saying, oh, now I'm a feminist, so coming out of that struggle when it seemed that men and women were together and united in a fight, how is it that in the aftermath you started to see these ruptures?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, again, Siddhartha talked about the fact that when we lose control over defining our history and our own movements, then we become vulnerable for these sort of things. Because I think in those moments on the ground, when you read the works of people like Kathleen Cleaver, Cynthia Washington, and others who were involved in those movements, you get one sense of the story. But then later, with the revisionist history, you begin to have the success of narratives of framing issues. So there are problems in the community, but again, it is the difference between individuals versus the collective men versus women. And so there has been a concerted attack. I find it very interesting, and I'm thinking about this, that the feminists attack Black nationalists and Black power movements in ways they don't attack integrationist movement. And so I wonder why they target self-determination movements. So it's not to say that there weren't problematic individuals within those movements or et cetera and so on, but so again, it depends on the person. So Kathleen Cleaver's assessment of that moment is very different than, say, Elaine Brown. And then I've seen later Elaine Brown talking about feminism on YouTube when they asked her questions about it. When she was the leader of the organization, she didn't take kindly to their assertion that only women were doing the cooking. And she's like, you're erasing what I did. And and what I brought to the table. So I think it is a issue, just like Clark used to say, the abolitionist movement, we need to, go in there with a fresh set of eyes and tell that story and to really assess. But I also think partly what complicates these issues is that this is in the 60s. There's a deliberate attack with the Moynihan Report. There's a deliberate attack when the Moynihan Report is saying Black women are too strong or whatever, and introducing the Black matriarchy thesis. Before even the Black patriarchy thesis came along, you had the Black matriarchy thesis, the attack on Black women, and Black communities stood up. And so I think we lost control of those narratives of what was taking place. So yes, individual people had conflicts, individual people disagreed, individual people had different strategies. But overall, when you look at some of these movements, women didn't have just a singular role in these movements. So a lot of times people talk about the fact they was relegated to the Freedom House, making freedom sandwiches and pancakes and bringing coffee. But in reality, when you look at the visual record, as Kathleen Cleaver talked about, you see they were on the front line, that they were on the highly visible and behind the scene. They had multiple roles. They weren't just a singular role. So they were in the background and at the forefront. They were the leaders and the foot soldier. So often that narrative is that the women were excluded, that these movements were not fighting for Black women, and nothing could be further from the truth. It is how you define our issues. So a lot of times people come in and say, well, they weren't dealing with women's issues. Fighting white supremacy is a woman's issue. Oh, you mean white? It wasn't dealing with white women's issues? Or how are you defining issues? And again, that goes back to adopting a narrow set of understandings of these things based on the larger society's notion of what women's issues are. But police violence is a women's issue, a Black women's issue. White supremacy, a Black women's issue. Segregation, a Black women's issue. Along with rape, along with reproductive health. And even that, something like that, if you don't look at it from our perspective, like, let me give this one example. They go back and say, oh, the Black men were just as conservative as the white men because they were skeptical about birth control. Well, you're taking it out of context. You're taking it out of context of the eugenics movement. You're taking it out of the context of Black people fighting less for abortion and fighting against sterilization. So again, you have to ground it. They were sterilizing people like Fannie Lou Hamer. They were sterilizing 13 and 14-year-old Black girls. So it was less to them denying us abortion and more so them denying us even the choice to have a child. And so again, if we just take this master narrative of what's going on with women and applying it to ourselves, we're going to misinterpret and distort our history. So I think we have to use an Africana methodology and re-examine this narrative, because it has definitely been dominated with a men versus women feminist framework. And of course, that's going to lead to a particular kind of conclusion.
And I'm glad that you brought up those issues like police violence and white supremacy, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was, what are some of the issues, that are facing us today that can be addressed from a non-aligned perspective or African-centered perspective? So I'm glad that you brought those issues out to show that, those are things that affect not just the women in our society, but they affect men and women.
Right. We need to put down the mythology that takes away our humanity. We are human beings. And to buy into some of the narrative that talks about us in a way that we are cheerleaders of rape or cheerleaders of This is the same narrative that white people have had all along, except for if you repackage it under gender, you accept it. We need to be aware that what we're facing now, the feminist narrative is not going to help us. We're in the midst of returning to the very, as Ali Misto of the Nation said, this is not like Jim Crow. This is the very laws of Jim Crow that they're busy putting in place. Whether we see them banning books, whether we see them banning the teaching of our history, where we see them literally engaging in voter nullification, which is a step beyond suppression. It is overturning election. The period we're going into, they're trying to secure minority rule like existed in South Africa. And so you can spend your time on a gender war, or you can see that gender doesn't provide immunity to any one of us. And all we got is us, and all we got is working in a collective way for our collective advancement. And this is not about, because the other side would say, oh, it's about, they have been poised to think that collective is a dirty word now, that it automatically means subordination of women. Not when women are the co-builders and the co-authors of it all along. And I would suggest to you that narrative is politically motivated, and it is actually a misleading narrative. And that if you could rethink that narrative, then you can not paint each other with very broad brushes and begin to put ourselves from a position of strength. Because all we got is working together to combat what is coming down against both of us, all of us.
All right, so I see that we're at past time, but we have one more question in the Q&A. Beyond our students, are there ways that Africana studies can provide grounding for those social influencers? I'm thinking about the current journey that Beyonce seems to be on, that is not where she was when she released Flawless.
That is an excellent, excellent question. And I think we have to think about that because regardless of, where we're at, most people are becoming, I would say, educated but miseducated through social media. And so as those of us who are more fluent in those spheres of using the new technology, we have to be very deliberate and intentional in trying to get those messages across. Although we can't put all our eggs in those baskets, because some of that technology, we have to do the slow work of reading and thinking. We need people who will do that too. And as you can see with Twitter Wars, that medium can be useful, but it also doesn't provide context and deep thinking over time. So I think it's got to be a combination both and certainly I'm not one that engages in the medium. So as those of you who do, we definitely need you to translate this information to them, because that's particularly where young people are getting their information from. And for all of us, we're all the guinea pigs and pioneers at the same time of this new technology. So we're the first generations to deal with it, but we have to be aware. If you've seen movies like Social Dilemma and others, on Netflix, it talks about the kind of downside and how people's consciousness are manipulated through these technologies. So we just have to be aware of both sides of the technology.
All right, Dr. Watkins, I want to thank you so much for this. This has been, it's just so much information, and but it's something that's very critical for us to think about. One of the things about Black studies is that it has its own orientation. So you can't just slap on Black as an adjective to something else and say, oh, it's Black, whatever. And so you've shown us how we have to critically analyze, these approaches to issues dealing with women or dealing with gender, because they affect our community. So thank you for that. Before we leave, I want to share with you what we'll be doing for next week. So on next Thursday, we will have Dr. Dawn Curry, who's an associate professor at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And she'll be talking about national transformation and violence in South Africa. So that'll be next Thursday here at 6 p.m. So again, thank you, Dr. Watkins. Thank all of you for being here today. And we hope that we'll see you again next week or in the coming weeks. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.